ambassadors, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, it is my great pleasure to welcome you here to USAC this morning to our panel entitled Implications of the Refugee Crisis, a Multidimensional Debate. This is the third of the panel series that USAC has recently launched on the issues of crucial importance for all of us. The two previous events were on the Middle East and on the Turkish-Russian crisis. Today we are going to discuss another subject of greatest importance for us all, and that is the refugee crisis in Europe. This panel is intended to provide us with an opportunity for a dispassionate debate on this issue, which is being debated too dispassionately both in Turkey and Europe at the moment. As we all know, a summit took place in Brussels last Monday on this question. This was the second summit on this crisis between Turkey and the EU. In this summit, all aspects of the relationship between Turkey and Europe were discussed, but a special focus put on the EU-Turkey Joint Action Plan. In this panel, our distinguished experts will assess and discuss different dimensions of the refugee crisis in the light of this joint action plan and that of the outcome of the Turkey-EU summit of 7th March, that I mentioned, as well as in the perspective of the next summit on 17 March for migration management, strategy and functions as a coordinated effort to address this current crisis. Turkey has fulfilled its commitments in the Joint Action Plan through new legislation, like allowing the Syrians to enter the labor market or reintroducing visas for Syrians, as well as taking more significant, more stringent security measures to stem the flow. Turkey has also allowed NATO to play a role in the Aegean. Yet the number of irregular migrants crossing into Greece have not decreased at a rate we all wished. The Council President Donald Tusk was here in Ankara, as we all know, just before the summit, and these issues were discussed in detail. After all this, Turkey has decided to take a bold initiative and proposed to take back all migrants, irrespective of their origin, after a date to be agreed upon with the European Union. The EU also has to then take a number of steps to ease the burden of Turkey and help put back the relationship on track. For every Syrian coming back to Turkey from the Greek islands, another Syrian will be able to get legally to the European Union. This will be monitored by Turkish and Frontex officials as well. The resettlement scheme will also be put in place. You will remember that visa liberalization was already moved up 1 year to October 2016. Turkey now wishes to have visa liberalization moved up to June. Naturally, Turkey has to continue to fulfill the requirements of the visa roadmap. Turkey has also asked to have a number of chapters that have been unilaterally blocked by Cyprus to be opened as soon as possible. Finally, an additional 3 billion euro to help the Syrians by the end of 2018 has been requested. This new situation is quite an arrangement, and a real game changer which should make the discussions all the more lively and relevant. So today, Associate Professor Dr. Başak Kale from the Department of International Relations of the Middle East Technical University will moderate the panel. I would like to take this opportunity to express a warm welcome to Dr. Kale and thank her for accepting our invitation to join us today. But certainly she will not only moderate but also share her valuable insights into the crisis. Osman Bahadır Dinçer, the head of the Center for Middle Eastern Studies at USAC, will inform us about the rising human tragedy and assess where we stand in terms of ongoing conflicts in Syria and discuss possible other waves of refugees. After Mr. Dinçer, our experts on the European studies, Dr. Fatma Elmas Yılmaz, will provide us with the EU policy response. Today, EU's policy response is perceived as rhetorically global, but practically very EU-centered. This will be of particular importance as many see that this policy response has major impact on the refugees crisis. On the other hand, Turkey already plays a key role in the refugee crisis by hosting more than 2.5 million Syrians today. Turkey has spent more than $9 billion only in the camps and much more for all the refugees. In this regard, our expert on Turkey's migration policies and the head of USAC Center for Social Studies, Ms. Elif Özmenek, charmingly will draw a picture of Turkey's position from the EU-Turkey Joint Action Plan perspective. Dr. Mustafa Kutlay, the head of USAC Center for European Studies, will give us the refugee crisis dimension of the EU-Turkey relations and pose a question if the refugee crisis creates the risk of an axis shift in Turkey's EU relations. Finally, we will be delighted to hear the closing remarks of His Excellency Mr. Hans-Jörg Haber, Ambassador and Head of the European Union Delegation to Turkey. After the words of our experts, the panel will continue with a Q&A session in which we would be very happy to take your inquiries and comments. I would like to make a final announcement regarding our event today. USAC Center for European Studies Research recently concluded a comprehensive report on the refugee crisis and its implications on Turkey-EU relations. The report asks 6 crucial questions and offers recommendations for the EU, Turkey, and international community to better address the refugee challenge. You might take your complimentary copies in front of the hall. So I wish you all a very fruitful discussions that will be of great benefit, and I'm sure, to all of us. Thank you very much indeed. Ladies and gentlemen, now I would like to invite our panelists to the platform, and I wish you all once again a very useful debate. Evet çocuk. Sen alabilirsin.
Tamam.
Hocam buyurun siz. Oradan mı konuşabiliriz? Oradan mı konuşalım?
Oradan konuşsam daha
Sonra
olur.
takarız.
Tamam. Okay, I will start then. Ambassadors, distinguished guests, I would like to welcome you all on this timely panel assessing the critical aspects of the refugee crisis in Europe. The latest summit that took place on the 7th of March in Brussels focused on different dimensions of the crisis. as well as its implications on Turkey-EU relationship. At the summit, the discussions centered on the application and the implications of the EU-Turkey Joint Action Plan. The scope and the extent of the collaboration between Turkey and the EU on the refugee crisis will determine not only the responses to the humanitarian tragedies at sea, but also the needs of the refugees and the future of the Turkey relations. All these aspects will be shaped through this collaboration. The relationship between Turkey and the EU took a new turn when the number of irregular crossings drastically increased in the summer of 2015. The civil war in Syria displaced nearly half of the Syrian population, as you all know, creating more than 5 million refugees around the region, 7.5 million internally displaced persons. In the summer of 2015, Europe was overwhelmed with the mass population movements and the irregular border crossings of the Syrian refugees. As the situation regarding the Syrian refugees was so severe, the magnitude of the refugee crisis has opened door to a new collaboration between Turkey and the European Union. No one can argue that the relations between Turkey and the EU have ever been easy. Since the opening of negotiations in 2005, the EU has lost most of its leverage with Turkey, as the EU itself has been consumed by numerous challenges, including the Eurozone crisis, the constitutional crisis, and absorption of the newly acquired member states. And with the lack of the EU's enthusiasm and dramatic changes in Turkey as well, this is not a blaming game. I think both sides have to think critically about the subject. Also, the process of democratization has largely halted, and Turkey relations have entered into a stalemate. Despite the in order to re-energize the relationship between Turkey and the EU, like the positive agenda or trying to create teams with the journalists, with the academics, with the bureaucrats, unfortunately, these efforts didn't really bring much of a result. However, the recent refugee protection crisis in Europe has caused the Turkey relations to acquire more complicated, but at the same time a strategic dimension. This tragic challenge provides an opportunity to revitalize the accession negotiations, as well as finding a solution to the human tragedies at sea. According to the EU's border agency Frontex, nearly 1 million refugees and irregular migrants cross the sea borders of the European Union through the eastern Mediterranean route. There are different routes, as you know, from land and from sea, but the eastern Mediterranean route is about 885,000 according to Frontex. And the result was a panic and disorder and the disruption of the free movement of people in the Schengen system. It is totally acceptable because nobody was expecting this amount of number of people coming to the European Union. And Turkey, in the meanwhile, has an open door policy, as you all know, hosting more than 2.7 million. According to recent official numbers, as of yesterday, it's 2,733,384. Apparently, this is the official number, according to the minister. With limited international support. As more refugees started making their way to Europe, Turkey has been criticized for not managing its borders effectively and becoming a highway for irregular crossings. But Turkey has also been arguing that this is not that Turkey didn't become a highway, it's actually a dam, and now it's overburdened, and now it's like flooding towards the European Union. With deterioration of the conditions in Syria, the number of Syrians who are trying to escape the violence has increased. In that respect, the ceasefire and the third round talks will be very important in determining if there will be further exodus of the Syrians from Syria. Within this framework, the EU relations, most notably in the form of action plan presented by the visit of Chancellor Merkel in October 2015, just before the national elections, was quite critical. Since then, the high visits continue, but the Turkey action plan has been usually criticized, but I think it deserves a second look, and this is why we're here. Though the plan is more pragmatic than aspirational, it could still be a very positive step in terms of the Turkey relations. The plan offered the financial support in Turkey's efforts to limit irregular migration, but at the same time implement a readmission agreement with the EU in exchange of visa liberalization to Turks. The plan also aims to revitalize the Turkey-EU relations with opening of accession negotiations, which were previously blocked, and a contribution of 3 billion euros by the EU to assist Turkey in providing services to the refugees, which was recently approved in February after a frustratingly long period of negotiations. So, with this money on the table, looking for multiplier effects to its economy and civil society, Ankara is now considering mechanisms to use this as a seed fund, more than just a result, for greater impact both for refugees and also for its citizens. And after the plan has been proposed, it was criticized being too pragmatic, unethical, reactive, overly strategic. But it's very important that we have to take into consideration that the aim of this collaboration has to be the fostering ties between these two parties and providing high protection of standards for the refugees themselves. This can only be done through an enhanced mechanism of burden sharing that require countries to address the root causes of the refugees' flight, assist those countries who are hosting the refugees, not only Turkey but in the region as well, with financial and technical aid mechanisms, provide effective and efficient distribution of the humanitarian aid, and I would like to underline this, effective and efficient, but at the same time to address the causes of insecurity and create responsibilities of resettling refugees while finding durable solutions for the refugees to return home. The latest summit on Monday outlined the critical bargaining points in this deal. And there is, on the one hand, the application of the readmission agreement, you all know, for the third country nationals. The readmission agreement is already in action, but not for the third country nationals. On the other hand, the detailed implementation of the visa liberalization process, a roadmap. 9 million euros have been spent so far by Turkey, and it's estimated that around 20 billion will be needed in the next 3 years, which is the course of the plan, as the initial stage. And therefore, there are still negotiations going on table, but there is more than 3 billion euros on the table. If managed skillfully, this can support a major public policy campaign both within and outside Turkey. In addition, this plan can be for Turkey make Turkey an important partner and collaborator with the European Union that it has been looking for so long, since maybe the Convention for the Future of Europe in 2003. This is a prestige subject for Turkey too. If this plan implemented, it will be possible to talk a model which can set a precedence globally. But it is a very complicated and challenging task, and it really requires a strong political will and support, both from the Turkish and European citizens. In order to receive this support, it is important to set certain standards for international refugee protection, respect for human rights and human dignity, as well as addressing the root causes of this movement. And we have to also keep in mind that this might just be a start of the problem, and there might be other crises that might follow. And we have to make sure that economic and social and political stability is in the region is ensured. So the summit on the 17th of March for migration management strategy will shed further light on the issue. But before that, we will be discussing certain issues, what will be the certain issues that will be considered within the framework of these discussions. Now, without further ado, I would like to give the floor to our distinguished experts to assess and discuss the different dimensions. First, I will give the floor to Bahadır Dinçer, the director of the USAC Center for Middle Eastern and African Studies. He will be talking on the rising human tragedy in Syria, unbridled wave of migration. Thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I also would like to start by welcoming you all. Thank you for joining us today in the third panel in this kind. Frankly speaking, my role in this panel is totally different from my colleagues, because they are going to talk about negotiations, agreements, talks, and so on and so forth. But I'm going to talk about the naked truth, which is the human tragedy in Syria and also in Turkey. So proceeding to the discussions, I will try to draw the general picture what's really happening on the ground in Syria. Actually, we are all aware of, very much aware of the fact that since 2011, there has been millions of people have been suffering in Syria. Everyone knows it, but so far we haven't seen a sincere, real commitment from international actors to overcome these problems. So that's why I would like to emphasize the size of the human tragedy, a very well-known fact, one more time during this panel. Before proceeding to the details, I would like to share my main arguments in advance at the very beginning. I have three arguments with regards to the humanitarian tragedy in Syria. First of all, unless we achieve a political solution to the Syrian crisis, we will be witnessing more people as refugees, or at least those already emigrated and the IDPs within Syria will not get back to their homes soon. This is the first one. The second one, if we achieve a political solution, it will not guarantee the end of displacement, or at least those already immigrating again will not be able to get back to their homes soon, as the country will feature a post-conflict state and associated problems like insecurity, instability, lack of economic development will haunt the country as a whole. So, the third one, in any case, whether we have a political solution or not, in any case, this is not a temporary situation anymore, the Syrian humanitarian tragedy. We have to find out ways to integrate these people, particularly refugees, to our societies. So we have to handle the refugee crisis in a more sincere way. And these people and more will continue to live with us in the upcoming years, so a sincere global cooperation is a must in order to overcome these problems. So after sharing the main arguments that I'm going to detail in the panel, I would like to talk about the size of the human tragedy in Syria. Beyond the hundreds of thousands of deaths and casualties, according to UN estimates and according to the local observers, the crisis has caused more than half of the population to displaced. I mean, if we assume that it was 23 million before the uprisings, now we are witnessing that more than 12 million people have been displaced, externally or internally. And actually, beginning since September 2015, the displacement re-escalated with the Russians' intervention, in a way in favor of shifting the balances in favor of Assad regime. And the most striking outcome of this was observed when tens of thousands of Syrians fled to this Turkish border after the operations to retake Aleppo's northern towns and villages from the opposition forces in collaboration with Russia, Iran, Hezbollah, and PYD forces. And however, such development is not a recent development. I mean, millions of Syrians have been fleeing the conflict within country in a systematic fashion since the onset of the crisis in 2011. And there are many different factors pressuring on people to emigrate or to escape from the country. We can categorize them at least in three. First of all, Syrians are pressured to emigrate whenever there is an increase in the intensity of clashes. Secondly, this pressure is further enhanced as the number of fighting parties and radicalization increases. At the very beginning, it was initially engaged in between two sides, roughly designated as the opposition and the regime, but now currently being participated in by at least 4 different groups: the regime with the support of Russia and Iran, the Kurds, radicals, and the more moderate opposition, if there exists anymore. So within these categories, under these 4 different categories, there are diverse subgroups which are also in clash or in fight among each other. The third one is the unconstructive involvement of regional and international actors. This reality also worsening the humanitarian tragedy in Syria. The unchecked involvement of Russia, Iran, Hezbollah, which is primarily directed at the moderate Syrian opposition, suggests the emergence of a trend toward further radicalization, which worsened the already existing humanitarian tragedy. And also at the same time, as there is a growing perception among Syrians, when you talk with the Syrians, you can easily observe this perception, that the Western countries, including the United States, have betrayed the Syrian opposition, and dispersion in country have turned radical terrorist organizations or radical non-state actors into a more trustable and drastic solution in the eyes of the Syrian public. So this is a reality on the ground. In addition to this, rising the number of proxy groups, has also been definitely endangering the future of Syria, even if a peace initiative attains success. So, all these suggest that there are no more safe zones within Syria, and the entire country seems to have turned into a comprehensive battleground. A general sense of insecurity rules the country, which is even valid for those that are ostensibly winning the conflict. When you look at the newly controlled by the Assad regime, the towns and cities, regime may become more secure for those supporting the regime, but there is no guarantee that a suicide bomber or a car loaded with explosives will not claim the lives of hundreds of people residing in these regime-ruled cities as well. Or when you look at the PYD-controlled areas, it's also the same. Now it might be thought of as providing safe zones for Kurds, but the ISIS siege of Kobani remains very fresh in our minds. I mean, it was in 2014 in October. So no one can say that such clashes will not reoccur in northern Syria. So the sense of security no longer exists in the country. The basic instinct to search for security generally leads many to look abroad or stay there if they are already emigrated to Turkey, Jordan, or Lebanon. So the consequent external displacement and the burden, the humanitarian tragedy arises. So what is worse? This is likely to continue. The current international political efforts and the ceasefire process are not promising when you look at the recent developments on the ground. Also, I would like to raise a couple of points about Turkey, the burden on Turkey. I mean, countries in close proximity to Syria has been transformed into veritable open-air refugee camps. Now, Turkey is already currently hosting almost 3 million, and when you talk with some Syrian officials, they are saying that it's over 3 million right now in Turkey. And only 10% of them are living in the camps. So the rest of them are urban refugees spreading around the country without a well-planned monitoring mechanism. So although the refugee issue should be assessed through the humanitarian prism first and foremost, given both the current scope of the issue and the Turkey's own political and economic difficulties, the issue must instead be treated as a catastrophic disaster with its all political, economic, societal, legislative dimensions in order to reduce the probability of confrontation not only within Syrian community in Turkey but also between Turks and Syrians. Security-related and socio-cultural risks increase with each passing day, are not going anywhere anytime soon, so we have to be also very careful about these risks. All in all, despite all of the genuine efforts of Turkey, the current multidimensional crisis is a far cry from what Turkey is currently capable of handling. Then we come to another point. Refugees do not always regard the countries in which they first arrive as their final destination, but instead use them as temporary transit route from which to pass on the countries they believe to be more prosperous. Now what's happening in the Turkish EU borders is very telling about this real fact. So in this sense, the Syrian conflict has repercussions going well beyond the region. And in that regard, it would be ironic for EU and Turkey to fall out with one another due to a humanitarian tragedy that has been aggravated not by themselves, but mainly by Russia, Iran, Hezbollah, and the Assad regime in Syria. So we should be in mind that at the same time, Russia and the others have been implementing a demographic chaos strategy, the aim of which is to place pressure on Turkey and Europe so as to paralyze their will or ability to act in terms of contributing to the political solution to the Syrian conflict and punish them. So we have to bear this in mind as well. So we need to work towards a comprehensive, realistic solution which would end the suffering of the Syrian people, create conditions for national recovery after achieving a political solution, and ensure continuation of Syrian statehood. Solely in this way, its repercussions on Turkey and Europe can be eliminated. And I would like to ask, as a final note, a question to the leaders of Turkey, to the leaders of EU, to the leaders of United States, and to the leaders of regional countries. What are you waiting for? Are you waiting for Godot? Be sure he or she will never come. So do something without causing more people to die. So I would like all these leaders to be more sincere, and they have to act without waiting for Godot. Thank you very much.
That's why. Now I would like to give the floor to our second speaker, to Fatma Elmas Yilmaz. She's the chief editor of Analyst, and she'll be talking on the EU side of things and the EU policy response, rhetorically global, practically EU-centered. The floor is yours.
Thank you. First of all, I would like to say welcome you all once again. I'm going to briefly mention EU policy response to the crisis, comparing the rhetoric and practice, actually. As we may all agree on, Europe has been gone through a historic test with the refugee crisis. The important thing and all the debates is about how to find the right balance for a reliable and effective policy response, especially in compliance with EU values and international obligations. The process after so-called the Arab Spring is an important sample to observe if EU has achieved this balance properly or not. So I'm going to go back to the EU's official stance approach right after the outbreak of the Arab uprisings, which EU saw it is an opportunity, actually. In 2011, to respond to the new situation in Europe's wider neighborhood, I mean Middle East and North Africa, to respond to this situation in terms of migration management, the European Commission declared, you may all know about this, a revised framework of migration policy. It is called actually Global Approach to Migration and Mobility. It's important because it's approved and adopted at the high level of the EU, I mean by the EU Council and all the leaders. And in rhetoric, it is based on a global approach which foresees a comprehensive policy, migration policy. This would be migrant-centered instead of borders, fences, stocks, and the routes. Under this framework, promoting international protection and enhancing external dimension of the asylum is one of the important objectives among the others. The respect of human rights is supposed to be a cross-cutting priority for this policy, I mean external migration policy frame. Additionally, the EU declared its intention to promote a mutually beneficial partnerships with third countries and international cooperation in a balanced and comprehensive manner. However, with the crisis running high, all we observe, the main challenge for the EU remains its capacity in implementation. I mean the gap between the rhetoric and practice. The EU has been widely criticized, as Dr. Kale said, for implementing one-sided and EU-centered policies in contrast to its rhetoric, as I mentioned earlier. Speech of the UN Special Advisor, Special Rapporteur on Human Rights maybe can be a good example because he stressed on August 2015, let's not pretend that what the EU and its member states are doing is working. It is the body of Aylan Kurdi in the Mediterranean Sea, the tragic incident, unfortunately, in September 2015 that triggered the EU once again, revised its policies and delivered a new comprehensive package of proposal. We all know that the primary issue was the revised relocation scheme to help Greece and Italy to relocate up to 1,600,000 refugees in the other member states over 2 years. But considering the refugees taking shelter in non-EU countries, the proposed scheme accounts just for a small proportion of responsibility, not a burden indeed. The President of the European Commission himself stressed the number is just 0.11% of the total EU population. Most striking reality is that the migrants missing in the Mediterranean is far beyond the amount of people relocated in the European Union. Let's have a look at the figures. Europe is the world's deadliest migration route, with the missing of around 4,000 refugees in 2015 in Mediterranean, and it's already about 400 missing people in 2016 up to now. In contrast with these tragic numbers, the relocation figures are far behind the promised stream. About 800 refugees has been resettled in the EU out of the promised 1,600,000 people. It is also not the final decision to give a refugee status. We should stress on this actually. So these figures reflect the reality of Europe, unfortunately, and how its response to the recent crisis is divided. We may say this is today a crisis of political will combined with lack of European unity that is resulting in a refugee policy crisis. I should stress this, not a refugee crisis indeed. Until now, the tendency or the common position in Europe is the agreement of security-driven measures, focusing on border controls, return, readmission, and fight against human smuggling, instead of sharing responsibility, showing genuine solidarity, and implementing fundamental values and the principles. In 2015, Hungary, Slovenia, Austria, and Denmark have built barriers in Europe, and it is projected that, unfortunately, Europe will soon have more physical barriers in national borders than it did during the Cold War, actually. So the open legal channels and safe routes, unfortunately, do not seem to be main priorities of the EU member states. Thus, rhetoric and practice doesn't match the EU's migration approach, which it is supposed to be global, migrant-centered, and value-oriented, as I mentioned earlier. However, building fences, deportations, or even destroying vessels used by the smugglers will not stop asylum seekers on making their way to Europe. All we agree is smuggling, as many say, is a reaction to border controls, not because of migration. Closing the borders will just make the price higher for migrants to pay smugglers rather than deterring them from their journey. To overcome this handicap, EU's migration policy response included a focus on externalization of migration, I mean the relations with third countries. All the rhetoric is about the promotion of mutual beneficial partnerships in a balanced manner with third countries, which we will also appreciate this. The third countries see the efforts of EU as a part of one-sided and burden-shifting policy. I will not go into details EU's approach to third countries, especially to Turkey, because my colleagues will touch upon this. However, let me just say this briefly. Controlling the borders solely by shifting responsibilities to third countries will not serve as a functional solution on its own. First, the EU leaders and European governments should ensure that Europe's response to the crisis matches its stated values and legal responsibilities under both international law and the EU law. The medium and long-term EU efforts to build capacity in non-EU countries will then be effective complementary tools and policies instead of substitute. Also, let me say, because this is important, a balanced approach is important because every ship full of hundreds of asylum seekers or irregular migrants that sinks in the Mediterranean Sea incrementally devalues the EU's credibility as a global actor. Only a positive projection of European values and ideals in managing migration can help EU's global role. The fortress Europe can do nothing for its effectiveness as a foreign policy actor. To conclude, we should ask, what about EU's normative power or transformative power, that is most important EU's asset for the foreign policy? This is why it is constantly repeated that the crisis has a serious meaning far beyond to be a migration policy crisis. It has a special meaning for EU's foreign policy, normative power, and further. And what Europe and the world needs is not short-sighted policies. This is just a beginning test because the future is projected to experience for mega massive flows due to the challenges like the climate change. The Arab Spring was a missed opportunity by the EU. The refugee flow has turned into a crisis, but besides risk, it also carries opportunities for comprehensive and genuine cooperation to be ready for future challenges. Actually, we should start by targeting the root causes at first, which makes EU-Turkey cooperation inevitable. So I think I should stop here. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I would like to thank Fatma Yilmaz for this comprehensive outlook to the EU's general responses. And I would like to give the ground to Elif Özmenek Çarmaklı. She's the director of the USAC Center for Social Research, and she's going to be talking about the Turkey-EU Joint Action Plan and Turkey as a buffer.
Well, it's a great pleasure to be a panelist in front of such a distinguished audience and in such a timely panel. I will take from where my colleague Fatma left off and discuss the effects of EU's current control-oriented approach on Turkey, and especially focused on the EU-Turkey Joint Action Plan. However, before that, I would like to talk a little bit about today's immigration control, maybe what the Arab Spring made very clear. Over the last two decades, what we observe is the governments of welfare states have the commitment of spending billions of dollars and using high technologies to border fortification, and have attempted to use other countries as buffers via different mechanisms. And of course, the target of this non-entry politics is unskilled humanitarian migrants, mostly transit and irregular. Today, this non-entry politics is being challenged dramatically with the refugee crisis, and the EU is facing with a major question, and that is, does the EU want a buffer state Turkey or a bufferizing actor? With that little note, I have to say a buffer state policy approach is open to failure, because only burden-shifting approaches based on death talk will hunt the EU back. So if we're talking about Turkey being a bufferizing actor, or in other words, a meaningful, effective immigration control partner, or a partner that can protect external borders of the EU, respecting human security and human dignity, then I have to start by saying the EU should use its transformative power and concentrate not only on the EU-Turkey Joint Action Plan, but Turkey's EU membership as a whole. Thus, in line with my argument, I also think that the EU should acknowledge the refugee crisis is an international problem. It's not Turkey's problem, and there should be international solutions to this very serious problem. So let's talk with the numbers before we go into the joint plan. As you know, today Turkey is the #1 refugee hosting country. I don't have to repeat this, but the numbers are going to 2.6 million registered Syrian refugees, and with other groups the number reaches up to 3.2 million. And Turkey has spent $9 billion, and so the figures are very big. But let me show you a research that was done in 2014. It's a little bit old research, but the numbers, I believe, didn't go down, if not up. This research was conducted in 20 cities in Turkey, and what we see as an outcome of that research is 50% of Turks say they don't want a Syrian neighbor. 42% believes Syrians are damaging Turkish societal values. 42% believe Syrians are damaging Turkish economy, and 84.5% of Turks don't want to be given Syrian citizenship. Furthermore, we know that 70% of Syrians in Germany right now are university graduates, and the rate in Turkey, is only 5%. And almost 50% of Syrians in Turkey are illiterate. So, when we're talking about the joint action, we should never underestimate a socially, economically, and politically refugee-tired Turkey. Within this framework, let's talk concretely more about the action plan. I specified 4 points in Turkey's major commitments, and I argue that these commitments will not be able to succeed without international cooperation. So it's not only Turkey's duty, but it's international communities' cooperation that will solve or make these commitments come true. The first commitment was to continue the efforts to facilitate the access for Syrians under temporary protection to public services, including education, health, and employment. And recently, as Ambassador Samberg said, Turkey passed a new law, new legislation for Syrians to enter the labor market. Furthermore, we know that 6 action plans right now are being underwritten, namely education, health, social policies and family, labor, or municipality infrastructures and development, and religious affairs are the main topics that are being, the action plan is written on. These action plans target to increase the human and physical capacity. Also, this year in August, a new chief advisor to the Prime Minister was appointed just to coordinate the problems with the Syrian issues. His involvement, what we observed, really brought a quicker action scheme. So these are substantial moves on behalf of Turkey. However, we still see if Turkey decided for the principle of integrating Syrian refugees, because we are still hearing the idea of temporary permanency from the Turkish officials. When I first heard this term, temporary permanency, I thought it was very oxymoronic. But the more I thought about it, the more it became fruitful to me. The temporary permanency concept might be very useful because there should be a human capital ready to rebuild Syria. However, this concept should be positively constructed by the international community. Syrian people should feel they are temporary, but also at the same time permanent in the countries, but be ready to go back to Syria and rebuild Syria if need be. And the second commitment was to further strengthen the interception capacity of the Turkish Coast Guard and step up cooperation with Bulgarian and Greek authorities to prevent irregular migration across the common borders. And so many things has been done in this area. You know that Turkey even allowed the NATO to play a role in the Aegean, and making cooperation with Frontex, and recently putting some effort with the Greek authorities. However, from the literature, as my colleague Fatma mentioned, increasing the capacity of interception will only force migrants to use more risky and different routes. We were just in the field preparing a report on human smuggling, and what we observed is some of the reasons for mobility out of Turkey is directly linked to the actions or statements and the policies of European actors. So it's not solely Turkey. For example, in the summer of 2015, when German Chancellor Angela Merkel said Germany is ready to accept 800,000 refugees, people started to, it was a major driver for them. And this winter, for example, the bad weather conditions didn't stop them. So when we asked them why they're still moving in this not still waters, the answer we got, some of the answers we got, the EU Joint Action Plan, NATO's involvement, readmissions, they're hearing all these stories, and that is a major factor for them to move. So as much as concentrating on increasing interception capacity, there should be a focus on developing a new agenda and maybe a new way of communicating the decisions. Furthermore, our research on human smuggling also indicated that although this business had ad hoc dimensions, it's very well internationally organized and it has vast structures. And recently, Europol reported that more than 10,000 kids went missing in Europe. That alone shows us combating irregular migration, human smuggling, is meaningless without international cooperation. And third one, the third commitment, Turkey's commitment, was the progressive alignment of Turkish and EU visa policy. And we know that Turkey already introduced visa obligation for Syrians to Turkey by air and sea from a third country. In this regard, the EU also should keep its promises, because what I believe the success, the key to success in the EU Joint Action Plan is building trust. So when Turkey puts a step forward, I think the EU should do the same thing. And the fourth obligation or commitment that Turkey said was step up the cooperation for readmission agreement. As Dr. Kale said, the agreement didn't start yet, but recently, by accepting 308 migrants, mostly Bangladeshi and Pakistani, from Greece, unofficially it really started. So today, I want to go back to the numbers, but 53% of Syrians in Turkey are under 18. And I always say this, and I will say it one more time. The kids who came to Turkey when they were 10 are turning into 15. The ones who are 15 now turning into 20. We all been there. These are very dangerous ages. And we know that 400,000 of Syrian children are not going to school. So what kind of a picture they have in front of them is very scary and very murky, and they lost hope to go back home. They don't believe in the international community. So what they see is a world of self-reliance and survival, which make the situation more difficult. Easier said than done, but what really should be done, couple of things. One, significantly expand the legal channels for settlement outside the region. Two, guarantee sufficient funding and fair distribution of aid. And three, address all forms of abusive practices, because today the lives of Syrians are criminalized at every stage. And four, vulnerabilities of the host communities should be also addressed. And lastly, and most importantly, I think, a positive language about the refugee crisis should be constructed. Thank you so much.
Thank Çağmaklı for bringing the picture together with Turkey's position as well. Now we're moving to Mustafa Kutlay, the director of the USAC Center for European Studies, and he's going to be talking about the refugee crisis and the risk of an axis shift in Turkey-EU relations.
Okay, thank you very much. Today I will talk about the refugee crisis and its impact on Turkey-EU relations. And obviously my colleagues have mentioned about the technical details of EU's migration policy and the joint action plan between Turkey and the EU. Therefore, I will not repeat them, but I will concentrate on the political dimension of the issue. And I will argue that in its current form, the cooperation is fragile. And if the parties will not improve their positions or revise their positions substantially, it's highly likely that we might witness a new wave of blame games in Turkey-EU relations in the incoming months. So, in order to substantiate my argument, I will touch upon three main points. The first one, the first challenge in Turkey-EU relations in the incoming months, I think, is over-politicization risk of the refugee crisis. We all know that this is, I think, an existential crisis for the EU. We should start from this point of view. Most probably the students of European integration in this room will agree with me that European integration is a crisis-driven process. Right from the very beginning, external challenges struggle European integration, and Europeans, by very creative ways, overcome this crisis, and in every single stage, European integration deepened. So we should underline this point right from the very beginning. European integration is a crisis-driven process, but I think this time it seems this time is different. It's different because the European Union is trying to tackle multiple challenges. In other words, multiple crises of Europe is what we are witnessing right now. The first one is the Eurozone crisis. We can never be certain that the crisis is over. No, quite the contrary, the crisis continues. But since refugee crisis is more urgent than the previous one, we now think that this crisis is over. The second important problem is the regression of liberal democracy in Europe and rise of illiberal parties or Eurosceptic parties. This is also another normative challenge for the European Union. And finally, currently we witness is the refugee crisis. And all these crises, I think, feed into each other and deteriorate EU's transformative power over its periphery. And this is quite an important normative challenge for the European Union. So in order to understand the importance of the question, I think we should approach the problem from this broader perspective, and we should place refugee crisis within this framework, I think. Within this context, we should acknowledge that first and foremost, the refugee crisis is an humanitarian issue, and the European Union and Turkey as well should approach the issue from this perspective as well. However, it seems that the parties rely on an excessively moralistic and over-politicized language in order to tackle this crisis. And I think that this over-politicized language or overly moralistic language deteriorate the cooperation possibilities between the parties. What I mean is, I think I can give an example about this situation. The Aleppo accident, the Halep crisis, recently we witnessed, last month we witnessed in Syrian civil war. What we witnessed in that crisis was that Russian jets bombed the opposition forces in Aleppo, and massive refugee influx, refugee flocked into the doors of Europe, Turkey, and Turkish authorities temporarily closed the borders. At that time, the EU High Representative and EU Enlargement Commissioner simultaneously criticized Turkey for living up to its promises, acting in a responsible manner, and take responsibility in this crisis. And this was, I think, a clear example to this overly moralistic and over-politicized language, because when we look at the numbers, the situation paints a different picture. My colleagues underlined this point. Turkey is now hosting more than 2.5 million refugees, and Turkey is trying to do its best in order to tackle with this crisis. And when we compare the attempts made by Turkey and the European Union, and if we approach the issue from basic indicators, economic indicators point of view, for example, we see that regarding key indicators, the EU's GDP is 23 times higher than Turkey. GDP per capita is 3.5 times higher than Turkey, and Europe's population is 7 times higher than Turkey. So, if the EU is to demonstrate equal responsibility and commitment compared to Turkey, it's expected that the EU needs to accept 60 million as per its GDP, 90 million refugees as per its GDP per capita, and 18 million refugees as per its population. And we all know that the actual numbers are far away from these hypothetical numbers. So what I am trying to say is that in such a kind of delicate and sensitive situation, the parties should adopt a very careful approach rather than relying on an excessively moralistic and politicized language. This is the first challenge that we need to tackle in Turkey-EU relations. The second challenge in the incoming months is the risk of an axis shift in Turkey-EU relations. The migration cooperation has primarily two important advantages for both parties. This is obvious. The first one is that it played a role of revisiting the long stagnant relations, which I think is very good in revitalizing Turkey's EU membership journey. And second, the process allows a better understanding that the EU and Turkey can benefit from each other's complementary capacity in a cooperative manner. However, the details of the cooperation so far, to say the least, suggest that the EU tends to recognize Turkey as a border or buffer state rather than a candidate country on the road to membership. And this is quite an important challenge in the incoming months, I think. And the current picture, therefore, prompts the perception that Turkey cooperation on refugees is part of a kind of geopolitical game in which normative and humanitarian concerns are relatively sidelined. And such a perception will deepen the distrust problem between the parties. It will also deteriorate EU's normative appeal, transformative capacity, and it's also bad for Turkish government and Turkish policymakers as well. So what I see here is a lose-lose game. So rather than concentrating on the geopolitical dimension of the issue alone, we should also prioritize the humanitarian dimension as well and tend not to use over-politicized language. The best way, I think, for the parties to tackle the refugee crisis is to consider Turkey as a candidate country rather than a buffer state. Because if the EU pursues an engagement strategy with Turkey as it did during 2002 and 2006 process, it would help Turkey to improve its democratic credentials, human rights, the standards of the refugees in the country, and this will create a more stabilized Turkey, and this will be a strategically important partner for the European as well. So what I suggest is the improvement of Turkey's candidacy process or membership process in the incoming months in order to better tackle with this crisis. The third challenge is a possible stalemate in bilateral relations. Actually, we all have dark opinions about this issue because the situation is very dismal, but I would be on the darker side on this issue because I see a very high risk of stalemate in Turkey-EU relations in the incoming months. And I have a couple of reasons to think so. The first of all, as we know, in November 2015 summit, the parties agreed to open up new negotiating chapters, and these are quite important for the Turkish side. The Turkish side do not only want to cooperate on migration issue, but also open up new negotiating chapters in order to improve Turkey's membership aspects. From this point of view, there are 5 negotiating chapters on the table. But the point is that all 5 negotiating chapters are blocked by the Greek Cypriots. And this will not be lifted as long as Cyprus question continues. So in the incoming months, we will witness a very crucial question. How can it be possible to lift this veto and accelerate negotiation process without solving Cyprus question and or convincing Greek Cypriots? And here is the crucial question. If this could not be achieved, then how could it be possible to keep the deal on the right track? If the parties cannot open up new negotiating chapters, how could it be possible to continue cooperation on refugee issue? The second challenge, I think, relates to the readmission agreement and visa-free Europe. We all know that Turkey is obliged to fulfill the commitments concerning readmission agreement, which are 72 regulations as far as I know. On the other side of the coin, the Turkish side wants Europeans to allow the Turks freely travel throughout Schengen zone. And I think there is a high risk at this point as well, because if the parties would not handle the crisis with great care and sensitiveness, we might observe a kind of new blame games in the incoming months. Most probably the Turkish side will criticize the European partners on the ground that Europeans would not live up to their promises by granting visa-free travel. On the other side of the coin, Europeans will criticize Turkey by arguing that Turks did not do enough to implement readmission agreement and stem flow of migrants to the European doors. So in such a kind of situation, we may witness a new round of vicious cycle or blame games, which I think is quite crucial to handle meticulously in the incoming months. And these all reflect that we see significant challenges on the road. And in fact, I think the current mode of relations between the parties reflects the language of cooperation, but the spirit of distrust. And we need to overcome this in order to keep the deal on track. And I think only responsible leadership on both sides can overcome this situation. And there are 3 dimensions of this responsible leadership, and I will start by highlighting these 3 main points. The first point is that my colleague Bahadur mentioned meticulously, the EU should act in a more responsible or proactive manner in the Middle East. As long as the conflict continues in Syria, refugee crisis will continue to be a destabilizing factor for Europe, for Turkey, and for bilateral relations, not to mention the refugees themselves. Second, both sides should demonstrate responsible leadership to depoliticize the issue and promote constructive discussions in their publics. The sensational rhetoric at the domestic platforms, both in Turkey and European Union, I do not make any kind of distinction here, the sensational rhetoric and moralistic accusations towards each other does only exacerbate the situation rather than handling the crisis. And the final one, I think, both Turkey and the EU should invest in Turkey's membership process. I see this the only way for an effective cooperation between the parties. A stable and democratizing Turkey on the way to full membership, I think, is the best partner for the EU to address the challenge in an effective manner. And this is also, I think, the best strategy for the EU to protect its normative appeal in a world where illiberal democracies are on the rise all around the world. And obviously we have more recommendations, and we have done this in our report. If you want to look at this report, we recently concluded with our colleagues at the Center for European Studies. We would be happy. In order not to take too much of your time, let me stop here, and thank you very much for your patience and kind consideration.
Thank you so much for that.
Yes, thank you very much for inviting me here. Also, maybe you should have to thank me for coming, because when I looked at the titles of your contributions, it was clear that the EU was going to be in the dock. And this expectation was not disappointed, with a few exceptions. I think we have a problem here, and the problem is that this whole debate is an absolutely poisonous mixture of moral, legal, and practical and pragmatic arguments, as you very rightly pointed out. And whenever your legal arguments don't suffice, you take resort to moral ones, and they sometimes conflict with each other, and that's what makes this entire debate so dangerous. So while we cannot escape these different categories of arguments, we should at least be aware of them and try to separate them. The first thing, or let's begin with the beginning, the responsibility for the war. I think we all agree that this is not anymore a post-colonial problem or the blame of Sykes and Picot or whatever, but a problem of modernization in the Arab world, very much with admixtures of a confessional conflict, and even within the Sunni mainstream in Syria between different directions. But of course, we cannot blame the Syrian government because it won't listen. And in these situations, one always looks for somebody else to blame. So the blame game shifts to who didn't manage to stop the war. Well, I have to say, here the EU has never aspired to a military role. This is rather the prerogative of NATO, of which Turkey is a full member. But even as NATO, we've been challenged, including by our public, including by our think tanks, including by you, I guess, because all the interventions we did, be it the Yugoslav war, be it Afghanistan, be it Iraq, be it Libya, be it now Syria, was either too much or too little. It was too light a footprint, or it was not enough. It was always intended to be light at the beginning, and then people saw the chaos that developed and said it was not enough. So it is a case of damn if you do, damn if you don't, very much enriched, let me say, by cross-cultural arguments, by religious argumentation. I think we are all, and we have a right to be disoriented on how to end this kind of wars, the Syrian one included. It's not that we don't want to end the war because we are not ready to for intervention, and the same is true for Turkey, which has not intervened in this war. So I think maybe let's recall, or let's at least acquit ourselves of the responsibility for the war, and also maybe for that it continues. I mean, we are not the ones who drive this war forward, and there are others, and they've been named. Then maybe, yes, one argument that astonished me is, and maybe it's a backhanded compliment for the EU, nobody ever mentioned the Arab League, the US, in terms of accepting refugees, the Latin Americans, the Gulf states, who have a lot of GNP and haven't coped, and take only the educated Syrians, by the way, and have taken them for a long time. So can we maybe get rid of this argument too? I think we are not the only actor here, but in a way, as you have argued, Dr. Elmas, of course, we have proclaimed these universal values, and now we don't seem to follow up. Again, I think this is something we have basically in common with Turkey, because at the beginning of the conflict, Turkey also said, we will cope with this ourselves. I've seen reports, diplomatic reports from as late as 2014, where offers of help were turned down because Turkey very honorably said, we can look after our Islamic brothers and sisters ourselves, we'll do it. And therefore, when the European Trust Fund for Syria was established last year, most of the money was directed to the countries that did not say that or could not do it, and that was basically Jordan and Lebanon, which administratively much weaker and financially not as strong as Turkey. Then, as a consequence of the surge last summer and fall, we tried to shift the balance in the trust fund and promised to devote 50% to Turkey and the rest to the other two countries, or Egypt as well. And in the end, we went back because we established this 3 billion fund refugee facility for Turkey as an initial contribution, as it said in the summit document of the 29th of November. This was, of course, the result of a diplomatic compromise. So, yeah, we've tried to share this burden. If you want to compare what Turkey does with the 8, 9, 10 billion euro it has spent with what we do, then you have to compare the same categories. And the categories are what we do for the Syrians in our countries and for refugees in our countries. Now, a cursory inquiry among member states here in Ankara has yielded a figure of some 6 billion, which member states have spent so far internally. I'm not counting the 3 billion, I'm not counting other contributions to international organizations. 6 billion, but how unrealistic this figure is, you can see from the fact that the Netherlands reported 4 billion and Germany only 1. Because Germany, I mean the European Union is not a central state like Turkey. Germany is even less of a central state than the European Union, and what they spend at federal level is surpassed at regional and local level by far. So I think we are in the same order of magnitude, absolutely, in absolute numbers, not in relative, not related to our GDP. But there is a lot we are doing, and I would also invite you to to consider the fact that we were confronted with this inflow in a much quicker rhythm than Turkey. In Turkey, it built up since 2011, 2012, basically. We also had an influx of Syrian refugees in the European Union. When I was ambassador in Egypt 1 year ago, I dealt with resettlement already of Syrians. And but it happened much quicker, basically, in the surge last summer and fall. So the problem was posed itself in a much more acute form to us than to you, by which I do not in any way wish to diminish the Turkish role, which has been great, and we say it all the time. On the issue in the Aegean, I think it is perfectly legitimate to, if we want to stop these scenes in the Aegean by preventive measures and by other measures, and I'm coming back to them. I mean, are we really responsible for the fact that refugees who have found refuge and bodily security in Turkey want to go on to the European Union, and why do they want to? And how does it square with the position of Turkey as the host to the brotherly Syrian population? I don't think we are responsible. We are responsible to stop it, but we are not responsible for the flow, and we are doing our best to stop it. But national sovereignty comes into play, both on the Turkish side and on the Greek side, which are the ones that are relevant here. And we work together with Turks, and we work within the European Union with the Greeks to stop that. And as was also mentioned, there are numerous conflicts. There's the Cyprus conflict and whatnot. So it's not quite easy, but we are trying to do it. However, I think that preventive measures, police, Coast Guard, etc., will in the end not suffice. What we have to do, and this is an insight that I owe basically to Attila Toros, the head of the GGMM, is that we have to influence the expectations of the refugees, their own personal planning. If they have to go back from Greece to Turkey, and then have the chance of resettlement in the European Union, then they might find them back to square one, and they will not attempt this crossing anymore. If, of course, we offer the right parameters, and these still need to be negotiated. But I think this has to be the task, that we can't stop it immediately. Depends on our decision-making process, which you know, because you are an accession country since 2005 and have to do with it a lot. So there could be no illusions about that. But I think we have a fair chance of managing it. You know, the discussion about the action plan, about the additional proposals made by Turkey. There are some people who again turn this into a moral argument and say the European Union has been blackmailed by Turkey. But I think that's extremely unhelpful, and the solution is really what you suggested. We have common values, we do this together, and we try to do it within a common framework, which is that of the accession process. And that is the logic of linking the refugee issue with the accession issue, which at first sight might not be a logical necessity. So I think we have to look forward. We have to understand this as a big occasion, maybe that came from an unexpected direction, as many big occasions tend to do, and we manage it. We want to do burden sharing. We think, this is not really discussed a lot, but basically we think that the Syrian refugees, I'm now talking about, the irregular migrants are a different issue, and in order not to extend the discussion too much, I'll leave that out at the moment. The Syrian refugees are best accommodated here in Turkey. You may say this is a cheap argument to avoid sharing the burden, but we want to share the burden, we want to finance it, we want to give them education, we want to give their host communities infrastructure to cope with the influx. But let me say this: Turkey is unique in the region in not having a significant religious and cultural minority. All the other countries have. Iran has, Iraq has, Syria has or had, Israel has, Egypt has, Turkey doesn't. Therefore, Turkey maybe underestimates the difficulties of integration of a completely different cultural background, although many Turks have made this experience in Europe, but less the ones who are here. So I think these people are best placed here, and from here they can return to Syria to rebuild their country. And the one thing that has always impressed European interlocutors who talked to Syrians was their willingness to go back and rebuild their country as soon as that was possible. I think we need to be realistic about that, as you mentioned. And there's an interesting discussion in Turkey about it. And what are the consequences for educating these Syrians? Should you go on educating them in the Arab language, or do you do what you can best do, namely educating them in the Turkish system, because they will ultimately have to be integrated there? I think that's an ongoing discussion. The ones we haven't yet really heard are the Syrians themselves, but I think that being neighbors, they are best they're best accommodated here. Of course, they have to have the opportunity to go to Europe, if only, as I said, to influence their planning and stop them from undertaking this dangerous journey. But that's how we manage. Some to Europe, certainly. I think the rest in Turkey. We must share the burden of Turkey in accommodating them here. It can also be turned into an economic opportunity. As somebody said, the people with an academic career go to Europe. This is not because we selected them. It's their own. It's the choices they have made for themselves. But we need to make it worthwhile for these persons as well to stay in Turkey, and that's what we are ready for. Thank you very much.
I think it's for the recording. That works. Is it because of that? Or is it because of, yeah, mine is working. That's the challenges we have to face in the dealing with this refugee crisis in general. Thank you, Ambassador. I think we had a very interesting panel that looked at the situation from different perspectives, and having the ambassador here, we were able to also see the situation from the EU side. I'll start with the Q&A session, but just to wrap up what has been discussed for all of you, I'll first try to remind you what the panelists talk about. Mr. Bahadur Dinçer talked about Syria and the tragedies in Syria and what make the situation from within, basically. How the situation in Syria is currently developing. And he showed us a bit of a gloomy picture, I have to admit, and I have to say. And he says that the sense of security no longer exists in Syria. So what is happening in Syria is what we have to look into, because this is the start and the end of basically the issue. The start of the issue because it just shows, as we say, people who are in the field working in the international migration, the push factors, why people are originally leaving, the reasons for these people to leave. Nobody, under normal circumstances, would like to leave their countries. So the push factors are very, very important and very, very critical. So it looks like there are different factors and different agencies and actors involved within the Syria itself, which is making the situation in Syria deteriorate. So if you want to know that if there are more people should not be leaving the country, then we have to look into the situation in Syria. That's also the solution in a certain way, because we really have to look into, and if you're looking into what will be the durable solution, as the UNHCR language will be putting it way, the durable solution will be the refugees to return back to their countries and to rebuild those countries as well. But the situation in that respect is also very critical, so they have to look into a country to look back to go back to. So we have to have a country to go back to for those people. So the inside story was very interesting. And then Fatma Elmas Yilmaz also provided us a very general perspective of how the EU actually globally acts and how it unfortunately failed to respond to the Arab Spring in terms of its global approach to migration. I think it was a good attempt, a sincere attempt in certain ways, but unfortunately the result was not what we were expecting with the European Neighbourhoods Policy, with the Global Initiative for the Migration Management. And it could have been a good example in terms of crises like this, that the EU would have been better prepared to respond to crises like in the Syrian case, and how the response, it should be considered as a responsibility, not a burden. I think we have to also think that this is a responsibility for the entire European Union member states. This is not the first case. I mean, we had other examples in the case of the Yugoslavian crisis, the Bosnian crisis, the Kosovo crisis. It's not the first time the EU's experienced a crisis like this. But we should not be only focusing on the border controls, but we rather have to look and find ways of shared responsibilities and find ways of implementing those as well. So the theory and the practice have to match in that respect. And then we moved on. Elif Özmenek Çarmıklı's presentation, very comprehensive presentation, how the EU had a more EU-controlled approach, but the EU's transformative power, especially with Turkey's EU's membership, that we actually saw that this was actually working. That's why we have a law in terms of asylum migration in Turkey, accepted in 2013. But the reason why we had this kind of law was actually the EU's transformative power that has started from 1999 onwards. But she also tried to show how this is not only a Turkish problem, but it's an international problem. And without an international cooperation, this commitment from Turkey will not be able to fulfill the expectations, like the Syrians' access to public services. So this is an issue of a human and physical capacity, and there has been substantial moves in that respect. And the temporary permanency concept is also very important and I think critical. And I have to agree in that respect. This is something that has been mentioned quite a lot of times. I mean, I don't know the main reason why we have this kind of rhetoric right now. It might be the reason that in order to prepare the public to the issue that this is not going to be a temporary issue, but this is going to be a permanent issue, that we have to come across with the ideas. But we need to have a new and communicative strategy, and she showed how different sectors and different percentages are in Turkey being hosted. We're talking about 50% of the population being under 18, which means there's lots of investment needed for these people. We have to provide them education. That's why we should not be having a lost generation of Syrians, whether they go back to their homes, or whether they are going to be staying in Turkey, or whether they're going to be resettled in the European Union countries. Which is very, very important, that we don't necessarily have a hopeless generation, which will create extremist kind of hopes for those people. And this is critical, and this is very important. And finally, we move to Mustafa Kutlay, and he showed that the cooperation is quite fragile, as he put it in his own words. And he mentioned the over-politicization of the risk of the crisis, and also it's important to have a look at the normative aspect of this challenge, and it's a normative challenge, that there can be a possibility of an access shift, looking at the Turkey relations, revisiting the Turkey relations, and we should not have a lose-lose game in that respect, and we have to consider Turkey as a candidate country, but not a buffer zone. This is very critical and important, that this process, and I'm a true believer in that too, should be revitalizing the Turkey relations in terms of its normative power, and pushing Turkey for further democratization, not only having a border guard approach, that it can provide certain challenges. So we have to be very careful, that's what Mr. Kutlay said, not to shift the issue into a more of a stalemate and a double blaming game as well. And then we moved to ambassadors' points, and I think it is very critical and important to look at from the EU side of things as well. So we have to think that, I totally agree with the ambassador, we're in the same boat here. We're in the same boat, and understanding that we're all in the same boat, we have to look at this issue as a common issue that we have to take into consideration, and we have to look a bit further the international aspects. So that's why the international support is very important, not only EU, but in the region and in the global perspective as well. US, by the way, only took approximately 2,000 Syrian refugees so far. So we have to look in a more global scale as well. So wrapping up all this, I don't want to talk anymore, and the floor is open for questions and answers. Okay, I think it's better if we just collect a couple of questions and then respond accordingly. Please also introduce yourselves while you're asking your questions.
Thank you. Myself, Associate Professor. First of all, thank you for that comprehensive and kindly panel. My questions are more related with the last two speakers, but feel free for others to address as issues are interrelated. Well, recent years show us that the more the number of refugees in Europe, the better understanding of European countries toward Turkey, or better appreciation of Turkey. Then, can we say that, and still it's obvious from also the observations, and I agree with that, we still need more understanding from EU, not only in terms of appreciation and support, but also understanding of Turkey's position vis-à-vis Syrian refugees. Then, can we say that Europe needs more refugees to better understand Turkey? So, that's number one question. And in that regard, it goes with temporary permanency, which looks like one of those political scientists invented words. And one of them I can perhaps joke with the situation. But let me tell you what I see more. Yes, it's temporary permanency perhaps in Turkey, but not for one day returning to Syria, but mostly with the hope one day to jump to the EU. And I think we need to keep that as clear reality as possible, again, without politicizing that, because when Turkish policymakers said this, that is interpreted by some European circles as a threat or so, but that's another reality that we need to be facing. And in that regard, I come to my final question. You said building trust. What it looks like mostly is like building distrust, and I'd like to hear your comment. It looks like EU plays a time game. As refugees keep amassing in Turkey, EU tries to keep them the longest possible in Turkey for the least possible cost. And in that regard, do you think any genuine cooperation from EU of burden sharing could be only by EU hosting more refugees, something in line with the last speakers, perhaps sharing of the EU GDP levels and so on. Mm-hmm. So that will be more interesting.
Okay. Thank you. Floor is yours. And
I have to talk after the questions because I shall make a minor contribution.
Okay. Okay, let's take the questions first, and let's keep the questions very brief.
Thank you. My name is Jasper Mortimer. I work for 24 Television. I'd like to ask the panel, and perhaps Ambassador Harbour as well, about the nitty-gritty of Turkey's proposal put forward in Brussels on Monday of one in, one out. This proposal, I believe, is very appealing. If you can ship back everybody landing on the beaches of Greece, then people will stop getting in the boats to go to the beaches. And through that mechanism, you can stop the drownings, you can stop the uncontrolled flow into Greece, and you can also put the smugglers out of business. The problem is that for this mechanism to work, you've got to ship back all the people landing on the beaches, regardless of the merits of their individual claims to political asylum in Europe. And that means mass expulsions. And UNHCR officials, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, all these organizations have come out and said mass expulsions would be illegal under the 1951 UN Convention on Refugees. So could the panel and Ambassador Harbour address how you might square the circle of the appeal of the mechanism on the one hand, because if implemented it would be extremely effective, with the reported illegality of it? Thank you.
Is there any further questions?
Thank you. My name is Lindsay from Kenya Embassy. I have a couple of questions, but I will limit them to 3.
No, please, just 3.
The first one is looking at the EU-Turkey discussions. One of you mentioned that this crisis is international. It's not about the EU and Turkey. And the ambassador mentioned the exclusion of the Arab League and including the Islamic States, Organization of Islamic States, including the UN. So my question is, if it's true that it's an international problem, the EU and Turkey should not just be talking. We should be talking of an inclusive process where the Arab League and the Islamic States and the UN provides also leadership and solutions. Otherwise, ultimately, it will not resolve the issue. The other one is the issue of the smugglers. We are just addressing the tail end of the problem. Nobody seems to be focusing on finding a solution to deal with the smugglers, so that, as someone said, we stop the drowning in the Mediterranean Sea. In my view, this appears to be, the refugee crisis appears to be regionalized. We don't seem to be looking at it from a global point of view so that we can find a global solution. If we leave it to the EU alone, we also have refugee landings from Africa. Nobody seems to talk about it. So ultimately, we need to have a global solution to this problem. Lastly, we are talking about the Syrian crisis. I wonder where the UN Security Council is in terms of, I don't know what's in your view, whether the conflict in Syria amounts to a war criminal, or rather amounts to war crimes. Thousands have died, including children and women. The Syrian regime has used some of the weapons that are not allowed, but nobody seems to be declaring the gentleman as a war criminal. Where is the ICC in this role? Where is the UN Security Council? Probably if we do that, it might send a signal to him and even his backers in Russia and Iran and Hezbollah. But if we keep talking about this problem, we will come back here again for another discussion on the same, if we don't deal with some of these issues head on. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we'll get the comment, and then maybe the panel can respond, and then we'll get the second round.
Thank you very much, Chairperson. And also, I must admit that the explanations, the exposés were so detailed, so clear that I feel there is no room for question. Therefore, I shall make a minor contribution. Actually, I am a retired ambassador, RFM, and also at one time I served as a member of the Migration Committee of the Council of Europe. Not the Council of the European Union, Conseil de l'Europe. Actually, the history of migration is as long as the history of mankind. And also, if we come to the recent times, Europe is very familiar with migration because all through the 19th and 20th century, Europeans migrated to the new lands and new continents. Actually, in the mid-19th century, half of the Irish population migrated to elsewhere. Of course, during and after the wars, First World War, Second World War, and also after the dissolution of the colonialistic empires, as well as the solution of the Soviet Union, and then the Yugoslavia, big migration flows happen. Therefore, migration is familiar to all the world. But there's an unexpected development in Syria. In Syria. Of course, there was the regular migration and irregular migration. Regular migration happened from Turkey to Germany in particular in the 60s. We had the migration agreement and manpower agreement when the economy needed manpower for the smooth functioning of the mechanism. They also imported big number of Turkish workers. They were guest workers. They were employees. But today, a great number of them are employers. They have turned to it, and they are fully integrated, mostly integrated. I remember with Germany, we used to have annual meetings at undersecretary level. And also, when we used to open the subject of Turkey's access to the European Union, the main answer by the Secretary of State of the German Ministry of Foreign Affairs was, after we fully integrated Turkey in Germany, we shall think about that. They're always telling this.
Yes.
But of course, after the first oil crisis, starting from 1974, they restricted migration. They allowed only 3 categories: family reunion and humanitarian reasons, humanitarian Syrian cases, and highly qualified experts, like computer experts and so on.
Ambassador, can we wrap up? You just summarize half of my course right now.
Two more sentences. What is important is preventing irregular migration, illegal migration, but also at the Migration Committee, we have established that the more measures, whatever measures we used to take to prevent the illegal migration, the human traffickers, smugglers, as well as the organized crime behind them, was one step ahead of us. I hope the conditions are better developed. Today, it's difficult of Europe, because the unemployment rate is very high in Europe. They cannot absorb easily the Union, because the percentage of the migrants in Europe is not so small. In Turkey, what we have today, we have 4% of the Syrian population, to the ratio to the population is 4%. Thank you very much. It's enough.
Thank you so much. Thank you. It's a very important and critical point that I think one has to keep in mind, that smugglers always will be adapting to the new routes and new mechanisms. So stopping it will be very difficult. I mean, these days we have the high tech, and now it's been asked that the WhatsApp is now being even used in terms of the smuggling routes. That's very interesting. I think there was another question on the back. Yes, please.
Thank you very much. My name is Despina Balkiza. I'm from the Embassy of Greece, and I want to thank you for the speeches, all the speakers. It was very challenging. I was challenged as a Greek and as somebody who is representing also the EU. To cut it short, I would like to ask your opinion as researchers. Perhaps Mr. Kutlay, Dr. Kutlay, is more suitable to reply to this. You have talked about over-politicizing the issue of refugee crisis with the EU. Indeed, yes, but it seems to me that it was not only the choice of Turkey, of the EU to politicize the issue, it was also the choice of Turkey. At least the proposals that it made on Monday, last Monday, it shows that Turkey wishes to make the linkage with its candidacy as well. It might be for the better handling of the crisis, yes, as Ambassador Haber insinuated. However, I would like to ask you, have you assessed possible risks of a failure or a bad, let's say, response from the side of Turkey regarding its obligations towards the EU from the Joint Action Plan? Have you assessed the risk of consequences to the candidacy process? For example, we have a bilateral protocol on the basis of which, by the way, those 308 people were taken back, and it was a drop in the ocean, as you know, and they were taken back after a long and difficult process. Now, if we take this bilateral protocol as a precedence to the EU-Turkey readmission agreement, I'm afraid that the prospects are gloomy. So it's a hard issue for all of us, certainly. You certainly have right to require assistance from the EU, but what if this cooperation doesn't go very well in the end? Have you assessed the consequences on the candidacy of Turkey? Thank you.
Okay, let's get the final question and let's leave the floor for the answers of the questions.
Thank you very much for this useful panel. I would like to ask my question to His Excellency the Ambassador. He mentioned that it will be better for the refugees to be in Turkey and to return to their home country safely. I think that I am native of Mardin. It is on the border of Syria. For that reason, I involved with this problem and I closely know this problem. Is it safe for the Syrian refugees to return back to Syria after the problem solved? Do you think that it will be safe? Because northern Syria is composed of the Kurdish terrorists now, and Turkish border, approximately 70% of the Turkish border has felt in the hands of the Kurdish terrorist groups. And the northern Syria is composed of the Turkmens, Arabs, and Kurds. It's a mixture of different ethnicities. And I think that it will take not only 1, 2, or 3 years, it will take more than 10 years for these refugees to return safely to their home countries because of the rising problems. And the most important thing is that these rebels groups are helped by the coalition forces and especially by United States of America. And I think that it will be not a heaven for the refugees in future. It will be very, very difficult. For that reason, the responsibility is global, and it is not only the responsibility of Turkey, because the fighters in Syria who caused these refugees to come to Turkey mostly coming from European countries. That is the problem. Thank you very much.
Could you please tell your name as well?
Doğan Bekin. I'm author and I'm General Secretary of Professor Dr. Necmettin Erbakan Foundation, the former Prime Minister.
Okay,
thank you very much.
Thank you. I will just leave the floor. Shall we go in the same or do same direction?
Maybe Ambassador?
Maybe the ambassador or like the house?
İsterse versene ama ikisinden sonra verirse daha iyi.
I think it should be better if we just start like this.
I have just a couple of points that I would like to raise. First of all, I think it was in 2013, I had a meeting with some German officials in Berlin who were responsible for refugee affairs and dealing with the Syrian refugees, and they were asking the same question. We offered help to Turkey, but Turkey refused this help. So this is not the first time I have been hearing this kind of information. So in my presentation in particular, I tried to underline the fact that Turkey is also not innocent in terms of dealing with the Syrian refugee crisis. At the very beginning, in 2013, we conducted a field research with bookings in Southeast Turkey, and we had conversations and interviews with many Turkish authorities. And one of the main findings was the fact that Turkey, for a long time, at the very beginning of the crisis, underestimated the size of the humanitarian problem and overestimated its capacity. But now, many things have changed. So we are now talking on a different equation. With regards to, in the second panel, last month we underlined the fact that there is a significant amount of power vacuum in the Middle East, particularly in Syria, in favor of Russia and Iran. That's why we are always talking about Russia and Iran, but it doesn't mean that we are ignoring all the other actors. Particularly keeping themselves silent or keeping themselves away from the Syrian crisis is also responsible for the humanitarian tragedy. So we can include the United States, we can include EU countries, and of course we could include the Gulf countries. So we are always blaming these actors as well, including Turkey. But now in this panel, since we are dedicated to talk about Turkey and EU, that's why we just limited ourselves in terms of EU-Turkey relations. Thank you very much.
Maybe I should clarify something because Ambassador Haber talked about why you didn't talk about the Turkey's responsibilities, and my speech was about the EU's perspective. This is why I didn't touch upon Turkey, but the policy brief that we have already published, in this brief we said that Turkey should be more willing to accept international support. Yeah, I agree with this. At the beginning of the crisis, Turkey should have accepted the international support, not to reject. I totally agree with this, but because of my perspective, I didn't touch upon this. Actually, I really agree with you because the change in asylum seekers, or just to prevent to go to the Europe, reach Europe, I mean the asylum seekers, is not legally correct, legally incorrect, because every single person has the right to search for asylum. So this is legally incorrect, so I agree with you totally.
Well, how do you think Europe can reconcile it with the appeal of this mechanism?
I don't know, the international community, I mean the UN, the Human Rights Watch, already stressed that this is illegal and you should think about it. This is why I also stressed that EU and Turkey should think their responsibilities under the international law. I don't know if they will look from the perspective of practical terms or just a normative way. This is why I said the normative power of the EU is the important asset of the EU and Turkey. So they didn't give up this point. They shouldn't give up this point. So they should think about it, but I don't know the politician's perspective.
Shall we move on? Maybe you can also add.
Yeah, maybe like we can say maybe the flow approach is the main problem in here, because I think it should be a case-based approach. The Syrians should be given, some kind of a consideration for the resettlement, and there are other groups within the groups that are trying to seek asylum to Europe. I think that's the most problematic part. I think that's what you're asking about, right? The other groups who sought asylum in Europe with the Syrians. Are you specifically asking that?
No, I'm just saying, how can you bridge the gap between one in, one out, which could stop the illegal flow, it could stop the drowning, that bring the people captivity, with the illegality of it under the UN Convention on Refugees?
Well, I'm not really sure how that can be done really, because I think that's problematic in international law. But also there's another problematic area where the others, other than Syrians, will be the case. They will be, and it's stated very clearly, they will be returned back to Turkey, and Turkey will readmit them. So their cases will never be heard. If there are asylum seekers there, their case will be gone with the flow approach. So this is very dangerous in terms of human rights, and there are a lot of problems there. The second issue I wanted to say, I mean, as analysts, our aim or purpose is not, of course, take sides, take the side of Turkey. We criticize them very harshly. I've been, since the crisis started, I've been working on this issue. So many times, we criticize them. And of course, in some cases, we do the same thing with the EU. Therefore, I respectfully disagree with what you said. EU has been caught very suddenly in this crisis. The crisis has been going for the last 4 years before they started to get to Europe. But as you say, I think it's a compliment to the EU that we've been talking about the EU as a leader, as a global leader. And I agree with my colleague. the EU should take the global activist role in here and bring those groups that you're talking about to the table, because this is an international problem, and I think, to be honest and fair, EU is the only global actor. If they want to do it, it's the only global actor who can do it right now. And then we were talking about, you asked about the temporary permanency. I think when I first heard it, as I mentioned before, I thought it was very oxymoronic, and I thought it was very dangerous. But the more I thought about it, and the more Syrian counterpartners that I met with, all talking about the lost generation and the reconstruction, rebuilding of Syria, I think if this concept is internationally constructed well, it might work better, because these people really should feel like they're welcomed, permanent, but at the same time they're expected to go and back, build their country. So it's an academic term, I think, but if internationally, diplomatically, if it's filled with constructive meanings, then it might be something different. And the other one, Mr. Ambassador talked about sovereignty, nation states. Yeah, we're talking about an era where all these are challenged. Turkey is dealing with non-state actors on its borders. The world is dealing with them. So maybe we should really question about sovereignty and nation state. And the most important thing, right to leave. People have the right to leave. They might be better off in Turkey, but people have the right to leave.
Thank you very much for the question. I think I will take two of them and try to address as short as possible. The first one is half question, half comment. Does Europe need more refugees to better understand Turkey? I'm not sure, but as a political economist by education, I cannot avoid myself by giving numbers. What I know is that at the beginning of 20th century, the population of Europe was 20% of the world. And in 2060, it's expected that this ratio will decline to 6%, which means that in a reasonable time amount, Europe needs refugees and migrants. So this is for sure, and I do not see any kind of solid counter-argument to this simple fact. But the problem is that the magnitude and uncontrollable nature of the crisis really overstressed the Union, and for Turkey it's also the same problem as well. And this is not only because the crisis is unprecedented since the Second World War, but also the European Union experiences acute collective action problems between member states. And this collective action problems is also another side of the story, not only the magnitude of the challenge. And here I think this comes to this sovereignty issue. Why do these collective action problems emerge? And it's actually a simple dichotomy. We are living in the 21st century in which all important questions are transnational by nature. But on the other side of the coin, even the European Union, which is the most supranational one of all political entities in the world, is still composed of nation states. So on the one hand, we have transnational problems. On the other hand, we have nation states sticking to their sovereignty and their short-term interest functions. Perhaps this also includes Turkey. We need to learn how to combine our preference functions and defend our interests collectively. This refers to think out of the box. I know this is a very fashionable term and buzzword, but on the other side of the coin, very important in this context, because by sticking on the existing paradigm, we cannot solve this problem, and the end result would be blame games. Unfortunately, I'm pessimistic about this issue if we need to think outside of the box. The second question, how to overcome the distrust problem between the parties, my answer is straightforward but very difficult to achieve. Both sides need to turn to their factory settings. The European Union, when engages with relations with Turkey, so it needs to implement conditionality-based credible commitments, as it was the case during 2002-2006. So the conditionality-based credible commitments is lacking in the current situation, and this is really decisive factor for Turkey to implement new reforms. On the other side of the coin, from Turkey's point of view, the only exit strategy, I think, is to return back to the reformist spirit. That was the case in 2002 and 2007 mainly. Is it possible? Is it likely? I'm not so sure. It entirely depends on the leadership of both parties and public support, perhaps, for furthering bilateral relations, but this seems to be the most likely exit strategy in the current situation. The final question regarding our colleagues from Greek embassy, yes, you are right. Turkey should not also over-politicize this issue. This is an humanitarian crisis. All parties need to be act in a responsible manner. We have highlighted these points in our policy brief, and we do not refrain to recommend the same thing to the Turkish government and Turkish policymakers as well. We are on the same page from this point of view. And your second question, which I think is very important, what would be the possible cost of a possible failure in bilateral cooperation? Yes, it will be a very bad situation for Turkey, because if Turkey turns into a border country, then it will put a decisive blow to Turkey's membership aspirations, if not put a decisive end to the membership process. This is really a bad option for Turkey. But also, if this plan fails, Europeans will also face a higher number of refugees. They will lose a very significant, indispensable actor located in an important geography, and you Greeks will have to have more refugees. This is the other side of the question. That's why I say that this is a lose-lose game, not even a zero-sum game. This is a lose-lose game, so we need to learn how to improve the bilateral cooperation mechanisms. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I will give the final words for His Excellency Haber, and he can,
Yeah, that's a bit heavy, but just to repeat it, when I said, when I mentioned the Turkish position 2 years ago, I didn't want to play a blame game. I just wanted to understand us all that we were in the same situation before a challenge which we hadn't anticipated. We'd begun to work with Turkey on migration management in the early 2000s. We built admission centers in Turkey. They are still here. We realized that Turkey would be a target for migration in and out, and we wanted to help to do that. But of course, these efforts were completely insufficient as against events which we couldn't foresee. Neither of us, neither Turkey nor we. Then the other question about the so-called resettlement scheme and how does it square with international law. You know, the situation is very difficult because Turkey has not fully subscribed to the UN Convention on Refugees, or not to the additional protocol, so that we are in the rather strange situation that if you had a massive flow of refugees from Ukraine here, you would have to accept them all because they're European, and that was the initial intent of the Refugee Convention. But this is not strictly the case for Syrians. However, Turkey has done this. Now, we are, or the Commission is basically talking to the UNHCR to find out how this is compatible, and if and how it is compatible. We are pretty positive that we'll get some result. The purpose of the convention is, after all, to give people security, bodily security. It's not to open them the choice of their place of asylum. This needs to be borne in mind, I think. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you so much. I think this has been an excellent discussion so far, and we've seen the different sides of the... it's gone again. I think my microphone, but I think everybody can hear. But I think it's gonna be an excellent opportunity for the EU to show its normative power. To be able to show its global leadership. I still believe in the EU in terms of dealing with this kind of crisis, because the history has shown that every time there has been a crisis, the EU was able to get out of it even more stronger and even with more solidarity. I hope this is going to be an opportunity as well for the EU to respond to this humanitarian crisis. And I would like to thank you all these distinguished panelists, and sharing their experiences, their expertise with us. And I would like to thank you, all of you, and coming here, and especially with His Excellency Ambassador Haber, and coming and sharing his views. Thank you.
Thank you.